podcast. Jarrod Kimber here. We're going to go through all your questions. We've got a lot of questions from Patreon. I think the World Test Championship, Ashes, clashing all at the same time has excited many cricket fans from around the world. And so it's absolutely plenty in the Patreon chats. However, if you are watching live on YouTube and you think to yourself, oh, something I would like to ask as well, feel free to super chat and we'll try and get to some of those at the end. But let us start with the Patreons. Remember, anyone can follow us, is that the right way of putting it? Support us on Patreon. And if you get the first class level or above, you get the access to ask questions on this show right now, like Manandid, who says, how much of a monster would Umar Gul be in today's T20 environment? It's interesting because I think he bowled reverse swing at a time where it was a little bit more prevalent, Umar Gul. So I think you have to factor in the fact. I think you have to factor in that doesn't seem to be happening as much in modern T20 cricket. So, and also he did a lot of his bowling before the scoop, and it was so prevalent. And obviously, the Yorker was his main skill. Reverse swing and the Yorker were his main skills. If he still got reverse swing at the rate that he did back then, then he'd still be pretty good. But I don't think he'd be able to bowl his Yorker as much, as consistently as he did in the era that he bowled in. But I mean, it's kind of like it's like Joel Garner, right? Joel Garner would still be a really good bowler in T20 cricket, but he'd probably have a slower ball. Umar Gul would probably have more variations. Maybe he would have bowled wide more often as well. He had a very good surprise short ball. He might have used that more in T20 cricket. So yeah, he'd still be a monster. But any player that you take from a previous era, like Viv Richards would be great in T20. How would he be great? Well, he'd have to develop, in a slightly different way. Aditya says, in your trawls through all kinds of cricket archives, what is the best cricketer's full name you've seen? Obviously, Chaminda Vaas is a classic, and I also can't look past SCG McGill, and the G stands for Glynweir. I can't even remember. Is it Glynweir? Something like that. Anyway, I've always liked Colin McCool. I know it's not. There's just something so stupid about that particular name. That's one that when I think about it, there's obviously, was it Napoleon Einstein? No, have I got that one right? Is it Napoleon Einstein? That played in Indian cricket. Was a fantastic name. Didn't we have a Lizard? Was there a South African player called Lizard? Along the journey as well. And obviously, and I'm not even going to try this one, but the best name ever in cricket is the Fijian batter's name, which is, just Google Fijian batter. I'm sure his name will come up. But it means, I know the translation better, I think it means something along the lines of returned home safely from so-and-so hospital in the so-and-so islands, which is an incredible name when you think about it. But yeah, no, there's certainly been some very, very good ones. I still think American sports has everyone covered overall when it comes to names. But I'm trying to think if there's any others that I kind of like the names that sound the best off the tongue. Like I've always, Venkatapati Raju and Dirk Nannes, two names that for whatever reason when they come out of my mouth, they feel really, really good. So I've always really enjoyed those sorts of names. But yeah, Colin McCool is the one that it still makes me laugh. It's such a simple one. The famous New Zealand name, of course, is Bob Kunis, who is described as neither one thing nor the other. It's spelled Cunis. Work that out for yourself. Patrick says, how much do tail end runs matter over selecting the best bowlers? It depends a lot, Patrick, on what format you're talking about. I'm going to assume you mean Test cricket because we're in a Test cricket climate at the moment. In Test cricket, 20 wickets are much more important than number 8 that can make runs. I think anyone who suggests otherwise is fooling themselves. You have to be able to take 20 wickets to consistently win Test matches. If your number 8 can average 22 with a bat, but can't average a good amount of wickets at a decent average, everyone else is going to have to carry them, or you're going to need a fifth bowler. So I would always say that the 20 wickets are far more important. If you've got one bowler who you think might average, I don't know, over a 30 test period, might average 31, another one who might average 29, I mean, at that point, you might say, is the 2 runs per wicket as important to us as the extra 8 runs they might be able to get per wicket when they're batting? That's a very, very fair argument. But if you're not starting with the thinking place of we need to take 20 wickets in this match, then chances are you're already in trouble in Test cricket. I kind of think it plays a big part in one-day cricket and T20 cricket. It's something I've been noticing a lot, actually, in Test cricket specifically, but I'll get to one-day and T20 cricket off the back of this as well, which is when Bazball was working really well, one of the big issues was the fact that some teams, and this wasn't a South Africa thing, so this would have been New Zealand, and some of this was injury related, but also some of this was them picking Michael Bracewell. You look at the bowling lineup and you're now saying, well, they have 3 functioning bowlers. And, you look at Umesh Yadav in the last test in the World Test Championship, and you get a similar sort of thing where you're just like, well, they don't have 4 functioning bowlers. And you see this a lot in the old days when Australia would go to, especially to India, but also sometimes to Sri Lanka and Pakistan, when they would sort of just take a 4th bowler who was a spinner who they didn't really particularly believe in. There is a big difference between having 4 bowlers who can keep pressure on and can be rotated throughout an attack, and having 3 bowlers and the 4th bowler not being able to do that. You over tire your main 3 bowlers. You don't have the ability to keep the pressure on as much. And it's something I've really been looking at quite a bit, which is, sometimes taking a project bowler in, maybe taking a fast bowler in because you think you need a different kind of bowler in that attack, but that bowler is only good for a couple of spells. It might be a bowling all-rounder. Someone like, Shardul is probably a very good example of this. Kugeline maybe in New Zealand, another very good example of this, where it's like in some conditions and sometimes they're very good bowlers. Are they over the full course of a 5-day match going to be the sort of bowler that you are happy to throw the ball to at any time? And it's the same argument you could make with Ben Stokes at times. If he was the 4th bowler for England, would he have the same kind of impact as he does as the 5th bowler? And you also see teams sometimes with 5 bowling options, but they really have 3 frontline bowlers and then 2 bowlers who sort of combine to be 1, and they struggle. So I think you're much better off in most situations in Test cricket having that. In T20 cricket and ODI cricket, if you have a plus batting lineup, so England is the best example of this, where that Adil Rashid and Liam Plunkett are giving you extra insurance all the way down your order, and you believe that you could score at a rate consistently throughout the game that most teams won't be able to do, I think you can actually then start to select some bowlers who are not as strong, perhaps, as everyone else. Although, to be fair, in Plunkett and Adil Rashid's case, I think they found really good roles for them and they actually did very well. But Moeen Ali's one-day bowling was not particularly spectacular, but when matched with those 2 in a similar period of the game, it quite worked. But the point being then is you have to know that your team is consistently going to make a high amount of runs and make them faster than everyone else. Then you can start to worrying about your bowlers having some batting skills. For most teams, that's not going to be the case. Your batting is going to be either par or slightly above par or slightly below par. If that's the case, then you're going to need bowlers. And you see that, there was a big theory. I remember lots of people saying this, but Gary Naylor was the one I remember. Gary Naylor would say things along the lines of, eventually every cricketer in T20 is going to be David Hussey. And I think a lot of people believe that. But David Hussey couldn't even get through his overs as the 5th bowler. How is he going to do it as the 4th or the 3rd bowler or the 2nd bowler? And in some ways, what we've seen now is fewer of those sorts of bits and piecery all-rounders making up the numbers, because that's where teams will go after them. And we still see it. I mean, Australia won a World Cup not that long ago with that kind of, with a sort of a slightly weaker 5th bowler and then hoping that they can get out of it. But they did that because they had a really strong front 4 bowlers. And so you still need that really, really strong front 4 bowler, even in a one-day or a T20. So it's not that tail end runs don't matter, because they do. They make a big, if you're a top order player and you look up and, I want to say Alan Mullally's at 8. Alan Mullally probably never batted at 8, but whoever it was in those famous England lineups where the number 8 was, a number 11 in the wrong position. If you're looking up, you bat differently when you know that. And I've That's something I have tracked with stats, and I don't disagree with. But you also can't go into a game where you don't have at least 4 buttoned on top quality bowlers available to you at any time. Niran says, would a World Test Championship model where number 8 and number 9 play a second division championship with Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Ireland? So that was the original plan. I don't really know what happened to that, but it doesn't really seem to be on anyone's mood. But that was the original plan. It was actually going to be originally 7 teams, of course. So the first 7 teams were Division 1, the second 7 teams were Division 2. Essentially, the teams in the top 9 have more power than the teams outside the top 9. So, you say here there's no incentive for some teams to get better at Test cricket, and would relegation model help fix that? Yes, obviously. There's no level of sport where, and I've said this so many times, South Africa get Test status in whatever it was, 1890, right? Because some English people wanted to travel there. It wasn't even what we would consider a Test match anymore. Right? I mean, it was like a 4th-string England team at best. There were people making their first-class debuts in that Test match just because they went on that tour. The best player for England on that tour went on to be a Hollywood actor, which is a fun side story, if we're being honest. But, these weren't professional cricketers in the same way that we think about it. And certainly they weren't representing England, and the South African team was incredibly weak. Should South Africa be at the top level of cricket forever because of that? Should New Zealand, right? Should Bangladesh? No, everyone should have to earn it. Australia should have to earn it. India should have to earn it. England should have to earn it. Everyone should be constantly earning it. That is what top level of professional sport should be. This is why this whole idea of Test status is so nonsensical. There are 100 teams that play organized cricket. They should all be able to play Test matches, and there should be divisions, and people should rise and fall when they're good and when they're not good. And if you're not putting resources, or you're not looking after your talent pool, or whatever that may be in cricket, then you're going to slide down. That's how professional sport should be. Thomas says, should all Test playing nations and T20 leagues allocate an additional overseas place for an associate? Look, I've been asked this many, many times. When I was interviewed for a position at the IPL, I brought it up then as well. I think it makes so much sense from a publicity point of view, from a PR point of view, from a cricket point of view, from a financial point of view. There are so many huge wins from this particular decision. And I know I've talked to owners who sort of agree with me. The CPL obviously did something similar. Was theirs Canada and the US, or was it just the US? I can't remember now, where you could have an extra overseas player if you pick someone from the US. I think it's a brilliant idea, but they don't want it. And if they did want it, I think it's certainly, I think in certain cricket cultures, it would be frowned upon because it would be not a local player playing. But I think essentially people don't care that much about associate cricket. Otherwise, I think we would have already seen this, Thomas. I mean, I didn't invent it. I'm sure I probably heard someone else say it and then just got fixated on it. Aditya says, would you see Sana Jayasuriya as a genuine white ball all-rounder? He took more than 300 wickets, in addition to scoring more than 1,300 runs. His bowling average and economy is very similar to Kallis, but Kallis is seen as a genuine all-rounder, but Jayasuriya isn't. I don't know of many people who don't think of Jayasuriya as a non-all-rounder in white ball cricket. The one thing I would say is if their economy rates are similar, one probably bowled slightly tougher overs than the other. But that's, just because Kallis probably bowled a little bit more at the end of the power play into that, that around that 10 to 15 over mark in the old days. And then probably bowled a little bit at the death, although he wasn't ever a death specialist in those ways. So Jayasuriya would have bowled the absolute easy overs. But no, I've written about Jayasuriya being an all-rounder in one-day cricket before. I think... I want to think he averaged around 6.5 to 7 overs a game. Maybe that's not right. Maybe he didn't do it all the way through his career, but I think I set the mark as anything over 5.5 overs a game over your career certainly suggests that you're an all-rounder. Weirdly, I think Darren Lehmann gets over that mark as well. So there are some random cases that, you might argue. But if you look at the amount of overs Darren Lehmann bowled, it would be hard to argue he wasn't playing he was playing as a batter, but it would be hard to argue that his value to the Australian team wasn't also as an all-rounder in that period. So no, I think Jayasuriya definitely gets it. I think that the big difference that you're really talking about there is I think you're conflating the test side of it, which of course Jay Surya also took over 100 test wickets. But I don't think we'd call him an all-rounder in test cricket. I think we probably would have called him more of a high-end part-timer. He had periods of time where he was quite high usage, but periods of time where he didn't bowl that much. Periods of time where he was arguably the fourth spinner and the fourth bowler in the side, and other times where he probably just wasn't as useful. But in one-day cricket, I mean, he basically played as their all-rounder, which gave them even more flexibility. They had De Silva's off spin as well. And there's another one I'm forgetting, isn't it? Was there another bowler? One of their other batters who bowled spin as well in that period, whose name is disappeared from me as well. But yeah, so no, I would say that Jay Surya definitely counts as an all-rounder there. Philip says, I heard Alistair Cook on TMS the other day mention the ends in which Broad and Anderson bowl at Lords, remarking that Broad was doing better from the end Anderson usually bowls in the first innings of the Island Test. This made me wonder, do different ends of ground have different bowling averages? Lords may be an obvious one because of the slope, or have you seen, or have you or someone else looked into this? I haven't looked into this directly, just because it's not the way that cricket stats are set up. So you would probably need to either code them. You'd have to probably code each game, I would think, and try and work out where the first over was bowled. I think in the future, it's something that we will probably look at. There's certainly, you talk about Lords. The other obvious one is probably maybe the Wacker, the Basin, off the top of my head. Trying to think if there's any in Asia that I can think of that might have those advantages. But yeah, so the Basin and the Wacker both obviously have the breezes that come from certain angles, sort of traditionally. Bowling at one end of the Basin and bowling from the other end of the Basin are completely different sports, if we're being honest. So yeah, I think from that perspective, there's certainly a huge difference there. I don't know of that. I do know in T20 cricket that it's something that some analysts have looked into because there are angles on grounds. So I'm trying to think of the ground. There's certainly Trent Bridge is one, but I was thinking of a West Indian ground as well. But Trent Bridge is a really interesting one in that now that they put that new stand in, there's like a short boundary permanently on one area, and how that affects bowling is certainly very, very. It would have to affect bowling and affect batting and affect where people hit. So it is something that people are starting to look into, but I don't think there's any traditional numbers out there that I'm aware of, Philip. Ben says, when England toured New Zealand, one of the commentators remarked that their budget was about the same as Surrey. How have New Zealand produced so many cricketers on a relatively tight budget? Well, first thing worth noting, Ben, is that Surrey have a lot of money. I don't think they're, New Zealand probably have a lot more money than Derby, for instance. They came up with a very good system in modern cricket, and I think that does play a very good part in that. I also think that their younger players play Test cricket earlier, which can go in both ways, but because in this era they've been quite successful. So I don't know when you want to go on, but even in the post or even in the pre-McCullum era, Fleming, Vittori, all that, they've always had a very professional sort of. Even though they haven't had the money, they've always had a very good system, a professional system, a good way of thinking about cricket. And you look at players like Vittori, Williamson, Southey, they come into the team very, very early and they learn first-class cricket through playing Test cricket, which means that perhaps their overall results aren't always very good, but over time, they are maybe more hardened than other players who might come from better systems. Who, you look at the Shreyas Iyer thing of, we know that Shreyas Iyer is probably a more naturally talented batter than most players that have ever been produced in New Zealand. But those New Zealand players from a very young age are playing cricket all around the world and learning what it is like to be a Test player outside of their home conditions, whereas Shreyas Iyer didn't get the opportunity to do all those things. I actually think that does matter a lot in Test cricket, and I think it might be one reason why New Zealand teams in general are very good at problem solving compared to some of the other teams. I would say that they're very good at getting the most out of what they have to, partly because that is how they come into the side. And that is what they do from a very early age. And if you go back, that's always been the case with New Zealand cricket. certainly post-war, of players coming in and having to work out how to make it work while they're already at the international level. Like Richard Hadley plays all the way through the 70s for New Zealand, and he was a really good bowler. But if he played for England or Australia, West Indies, I don't think he would have played as much. He wouldn't have worked on his game as much. And I do think there is a big difference about that. Modern times, they were very, very good at talent identification and then work. Their A team, I think, has been very, very well done. I think Tim Wigmore's done a lot of work on this. I can't remember if someone else had written about it as well. But the entire system, I did a podcast with Peter McGlashan, a while back now, and we were talking about the little decisions they made all the way through really matters. The other thing is that I've always thought that one of Australia's problems with talent, and this go back into that same era of Hadley and Lilly. When Lilly got injured, at that point, Australia basically went, oh, well, you'll come back or you won't come back, right? And I do think in New Zealand, even from a smaller level, there hasn't always been that kind of thinking. Because they don't know if they're going to get another player of that level. And so there probably is more of we're not going to find another Hadley if Hadley gets injured. So we're going to have to find someone else, which also, and if you look at the history of New Zealand cricket, when Turner disappears, when Stewie Dempster disappears, when they do lose their players, the next best batter, if they lose one of their 6 best batters, or their best batter in the case of Dempster and Turner, their 7th best batter quite often was, a first-class batter, not another test player. And so there's all that sort of stuff. But I do think there is a different way of thinking about cricket that has come out of New Zealand, which actually is one of the reasons that they overperform in tournaments, because I think they're much better at dealing with setbacks in a way that some of the better teams are not. And so I do think it works a little bit differently from that point of view. But a lot has to go to Mike Hesson, Kane Williamson, Gary Stead, all those sorts of different, and there's heaps of them, McCullum, so many people behind the scenes as well, of setting up a system where there was always a backup player that was available. And I think that was the big difference between following New Zealand in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Maybe 80s is where it starts to change. But if you go back, it's like, the 7th best batter is maybe the 100th best batter in England, right? And that's no longer the case. The 7th best batter now is Will Young, right? Is he out of the team at the moment? And they have fostered that environment in a very smart way. Niran says, Karunaratne and Lakmal were both mediocre players in 2017. Both were retired as greats of Sri Lankan cricket. Whose improvement as a test player was more remarkable? It has to be Karunaratne. I think that Lakmal, if you look at his figures, he's one of those guys that really, really benefited from the fact that no one could play pace bowling or whatever it was, the wobble ball and LBWs and DRS and all those things. He was also used a lot better by Sri Lanka after that point. I remember him bowling in England in, I want to say 2012 or 2014, around that period, and thinking this guy's a really good bowler. But it just never seemed to work for him, and he eventually worked it out. Why I'd say Karunaratne is the only difference I would say is that Karunaratne did it in a batting era, a bowling era. He did it in a bowling era. So to improve your batting from 2017 through to now, when it's been so tough for people to score runs, and he's been, I don't know if you looked at that entire period, would he be an automatic World 11 opener? He's at least in the conversation, right? He's at least in the conversation with that. And at times he was probably, the world's best opener. Lakmal was fantastic, but everyone was fantastic. Whereas I think Karunaratne was fantastic, and fewer people were fantastic. But they're both been incredible. I think both of them have been nominated for my Most Improved Player awards before. So, from that perspective, you can tell that they both had, big jumps up. Will says, love the podcast about whether Ireland should have played the test against England. Do you think Scotland would have given England a noticeably worse game than Ireland if they got the call instead? Well, Ireland is still keeping one eye on red ball cricket. I don't work for Scottish cricket anymore, but it doesn't feel from a distance that Scottish cricket are really keeping any eye on it. They want to do as well as they can in white ball cricket. They have a very good white ball team as well. So from that perspective, I think they would have done far better. The question is also what Scottish players would have turned up. For the World Cup qualifiers, they're not going to have their best team. Ireland had pretty much everyone available to them except for Josh Little, who they didn't play. That is not going to be the case if Scotland had played. I'm trying to go through. So Scotland would have. I don't think Scotland would have as good a batting lineup as Ireland in red ball cricket at the moment. There are probably times when they had a really good batting lineup for red ball cricket, but I don't think they do right now. And I don't think that bowling is any stronger than Ireland's in red ball cricket. I'd have to go through all the numbers. And it also, as I said, does depend on who's available for Scotland and everything else. But all things considered, I'm not sure Scotland would have been that much better in that game than Ireland. But it's an interesting thought experiment. Aditya says, what do you think Andrew McDonald has brought differently to the Australian team compared to previous coaches? Do you think this Australian Test team is the best team since 2007? Well, that's a bigger question. The second part. First part is that I think Andrew McDonald coaches the team in the way that in a much more modern way than it was being coached before. I think the coaching of the Australian cricket team before was a lot of yelling, a lot of just try harder, a lot of be tougher. And not only, I think we know that that's kind of never worked, but it probably in the past was more acceptable, and so players would accept that. Whereas I think modern players are like, why is this guy yelling at us again? I mean, there's the famous story about Darren Lehman, telling everyone just to hit the ball, and just hit the ball and show intent and all this sort of stuff. And there's a player going, well, I keep nicking off the second slip. Can anyone help me with the technical problem? And I think that's what the team was looking for. I think there are a lot of players there who felt that they knew a lot about cricket and that their methods, the Maxwell story is one of the most interesting ones. Maxwell felt stunted by the Australian team at times because he thought his preparation methods had worked for him to get him to that level. And they thought that they were silly. And it ended up causing a rift between them all, I think. And so I think Andrew McDonald's done that. Is it the best Australian Test team since 2007? Weirdly, Australia has had some good 11s in that time. So if you look at the 13-14 series, there's some good plays in that 11. Is it better than this team? Well, there's a part of me that just thinks that Cameron Green changes the entire dynamic of the team in such a way that Shane Watson sadly was never able to do, even though he obviously came close at times, that it should be a better team than any other team in that era. But I'd have to go through it. Certainly over a long period of time, I would think that this is a better team. You look at that World Test Championship, pretty much since they lost to India. I thought India did fantastically well in Pakistan. World Test Championship. Look at the backups that they have available to them. Boland, Nisa, spin with Todd Murphy. Oh, I don't know if anyone can hear me. Oh, don't know what happened there, everyone. Sorry. Yeah, I think from that perspective, I'd have to go through all the individual teams, but over a long period of time, this does feel like one of the better teams. I mean, they won but then they lost in Pakistan at the end, or did they draw that series in UAE? Yeah. It feels like one of the better ones. I've been saying for a while that they've been assembling a really, really good thing. I suppose we still need to see Carey over a long period of time. Green might need to pick up a little bit, and the Warner Khawaja retirements / droppings / loss of form is still a slight issue. But it's and Travis Head, I still think is a very good player, but I still think he's got a ton of flaws, which actually makes it more interesting from my perspective. But, there are still issues abound. Also, if they did get a couple of injuries to their batters, for instance, would this team look as good, or would it suddenly fall off a little bit? And I think when you factor all that in, a World Test Championship, you have to factor in that Australia had one injury and they had a like-for-like replacement for that one injury. Whereas, India had multiple injuries and they caused follow-on impacts as well. All right, let's take a quick break. And after the break, we will come back. I've got a few more Patreons and then I'll check the room as well. But thank you for listening to Wagon Wheel Podcast. I'm still Jarrod Kimber. And I just see that we're still Muku put the Shubman Gill wicket up in here the other day. I always played that instead of an ad. But you've seen that before. So instead, we'll take a quick break. If you like what we are making here and you want to know if you can help out, well, you can. On top of asking super chats on our lives, you can also support us through Patreon or buy me a coffee. The more support we can get, the better and more videos we can make. On Patreon, there are plenty of other things we offer too, like a Discord server, the chance to ask questions directly, AMAs, and early versions of our recordings. This channel only exists because people like you help support it. We have to buy equipment, software, pay wages, and my mortgage, I suppose, just to make this stuff happen. And if you don't have any money available to spend, it isn't just your money we want. Shares, likes, retweets, comments, subscriptions, the little bell icon thing, all of it. They help us build and become more professional, make more videos, better videos, all that sort of stuff. So thank you for watching everything we make and for all your support so far. All right. What have we got here? Gary says, what do you think is Harry Tector's ceiling? Kid just keeps making a massive amount of runs for someone with his experience. I think Harry Tector's a fantastic player. I still think he's a much better player than Lorcan Tucker, although I find Lorcan Tucker maybe one of the most confusing people in the world to follow. But I do think that Harry Tector is very good technically. I wonder if at times he can be a little bit Terry Test match. There's something about his inability to adapt to different fields and different looks from bowlers that I wonder if that keeps his ceiling from being, someone who can average 45 in Test cricket and 40 plus in ODI cricket. I think at the moment, if he averaged, mid to low 40s in either of those two formats, Ireland have a fantastic player that they can help build around and hopefully continue to find more players. Unless something changes drastically in the way he plays, I would think that is where his limit is. T20 cricket, I just wonder, I think he just needs to find a method where he can score more freely early on to take pressure off himself so he doesn't have to play the great innings later on. And you could argue the same in ODI cricket. And again, it's that kind of, he has the skills and he reads the ball quite well. I wonder if he always reads the game situation as well and the individual moments as well. And I think that's the difference between, being a very talented player and being a top level player. For him anyway. Emron says, if you were to play a test match series across the world in every test playing country, which test teams nation all-time 11 do you think would be the best? For argument's sake, give them a squad of 15 to choose from for this hypothetical 12-match series. So if I had to play a test match across every place in the world, it's probably a boring question answer, Emran, but it's probably Australia, isn't it? Because in Australia you get Bill O'Reilly, Shane Warne. So they should be, Bill O'Reilly should bowl a lot better in Asia than Shane Warne would. They've got McGrath. You probably put Miller in that side as well. Name your Pat Cummins, Dennis Lilly, Fred Spofford, if you want to go back that far. There's plenty of other great Australian seamers that you could match up there. Linmore is another one. Alan Davidson would be a fantastic one as well. From that perspective, your wicket keepers is what? Adam Gilchrist, or you can pick one of the best specialist wicket keepers of all time, where they had, they probably picked specialist wicket keepers a lot longer than some other nations did. So they've got fantastic wicket keeping depth. You've got opening batters. So there's plenty to choose from there. Bradman, Ponting, Chappell, Steve Smith in your middle order. there's some really other good teams. So, for instance, West Indies is going to struggle with spin outside of Lance Gibbs. The other spinners, they had some other good spinners, but I'm not sure if there was anyone of that level. But batting is not a problem for the West Indies. All-rounder is not a problem because of Sobers, and certainly fast bowling is not a problem, but they're not quite as strong. India struggle with seam bowling. Boomer and Kapil Dev are really good, but they would struggle. Who's the third best seamer in that lineup is quite interesting. Spinner's obviously not an issue for them. Kapil Dev covers their all-rounder. Also, I suppose Vinu Mankad's probably not quite good enough. I don't know what Shastri's record is, if he helps them. I'm not sure if he probably doesn't slip into that side. Jadeja, actually, is probably the other all-rounder, so they're okay from that perspective as well. Certainly not a problem for batting. Say Wagon Gavaskar open the batting for them, and then middle order is fine. Pakistan. I wonder who Pakistan's best opening batters are. If they have someone that are all-time opening batters, some good opening batters. Middle order batters clearly not a problem for Pakistan. Imran Khan covers the all-round option there quite nicely. They got spin and pace quite well covered. Do they have a wicket keeper? Is it Safras? Which was hilarious, but is it do they pick a more specialist wicket keeper? India would be Dhoni or Pant, right? As well, just going back to there. In fact, wicket keeper for the West Indies. Oh, would you get Walcott to do it and break his back? I don't think South Africa is the other one. South Africa, you've got a couple of their early spinners. It depends on how much you rate, people like Aubrey Faulkner. Take a drink if you're listening, and certainly have the all-round talent. Where you factor in some of those players who didn't play as much Test cricket becomes a little bit awkward with how you ultimately have a look at that side. But who would the bowlers be? It would be Steyn, Rabada, Donald. Don't think Neil Adcock's quite at that level. Then you've got Callis. You've got Callis and Faulkner. Proctor's an interesting one. Smith opens the batting with Kirsten, does he? I think. I think it's Australia. It's a really fascinating question, but I think that's the case just because they have covered the most things. And if you're picking an all-time 11, they have the ability to put all-rounders into those teams that they haven't always had access to, even when they're being some of the best teams. So that gives them even more flexibility. Like, for instance, Gilchrist batted at 7, but if you wanted to, Gilchrist could have batted at 6 in some of those positions, which give them even more. You could have Miller at 5, Gilchrist at 6, and then Davidson or Richie Benaud at 7, if you wanted to, depending on how your final 15 is made up. So there's incredible flexibility there with the Australian team once you have, Miller and Gilchrist involved, which is probably the one thing that the Australian team consistently has not had as much flexibility as some of the other teams that have found great all-rounders. I haven't done England. So England, batting is absolutely not an issue all the way up. Who's the wicketkeeper for England? Is it Bairstow? Is it Pryor? That feels like a drop-off from some of the other, maybe some of the other options out there. Both fantastic cricketers, but all-time great. Unless you go Les Ames, he's always tricky. Or even Alan Knott. So that's a tricky one there. And then the spinners, you would have to say even the best spinners that they've had are probably not at the level of someone else. So they probably struggle a little bit with the spinners from that perspective. Yes, this is very, very fun. I'm going to leave that question there because otherwise I will spend the rest of my life on it. Josh says, was Devon Conway the best value for dollar player in this IPL? I'd have to go through all the signings and have a look at. I think when you're doing that, you want to look at the efficiency of the players involved, but also the overall value, games played, runs made, wickets, overs bowled, I should say, all those sorts of things. But I think he was undervalued, and I think this happens a lot with Chennai. I think Chennai find players that they know will do a very, very good job. And I think other teams still are looking for the next AB de Villiers or the next star in a different way. And I think Chennai have been brilliant at getting great role players over a long period of time and backing them. Oh, Josh again says, which of these bowlers would be thought of as best in 4 years' time? Boland, Jameson, or Nortje? Ooh, I don't think it's Boland. I think he's fantastic, but I don't think it's Boland. Jameson is interesting because of the injuries that we've seen, and I wonder how fit he's going to be over the next 4 years. Nortje should be the best bowler out of these 4, but I wonder if he's the one most likely to go off and play T20 cricket, which might change his reputation overall. Also, he's had a couple of poor years in T20 cricket of recent times. I think I would, if injuries weren't a concern, I think I would pick Jameson because I don't think there's anything that can go wrong with his bowling unless he suddenly slows him by a yard. Whereas I think Boland, a lot of overs. He's a one format cricketer who may even find himself in a sort of Colin Miller type situation, Adam Voges type situation, whereas they think he's fantastic, but the first sign of any weakness, they're just going to flick him and bring in someone younger and faster. And Nortje, my only question with Nortje at the moment is just that what format he wants to play. And, my assumption is he will become a T20 player. I think he's been fantastic when he's played T20, but he hasn't looked as good over the last little while. Certainly in the IPL. I'm not sure about his numbers everywhere else. Cullum says, do players care about match fee fines? Yes, they care about all money being taken out of their pocket, the same way that you would. If your boss fined you, 30 quid a day for being late, and you might make, depending on your job, Callum, a couple of 100 quid a day, I think you'd still be annoyed at getting the 30 quid out or the 3 quid that you lost. It's all frustrating. This is the 15 years that they make money. I would say, though, that if player fines were massively important to players, we would see that the fines that you get for slow over rates would have fixed that. And that they didn't, I think probably suggests to you that they are an annoyance rather than something that changes behavior. I think when you're looking for, I think suspension is a much better thing than player fines, because, and I'm not saying that you should obviously fine before you suspend, but a suspension means that you are going to miss a game and an opportunity, and someone else might take your spot, or you might. I think a fine that's an annoyance because I wanted to make that money and I haven't made money. But if you're Shubman Gill, it's funny that he ended up having to pay to play in the World Test Championship, like he's some club cricketer playing for the umpires and the balls. But ultimately, the money that he's earning, his match fee from the BCCI is, I don't know what the match fees are, but I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to him. Will says, what do you think about Ben Stokes opening? It would fit both Bairstow and Brooks in the middle order to squeeze in another bowler, and Stokes would focus on his batting. Given McCullum did something similar, it would fit from that perspective. I think that they're very different kinds of batters, and that the new ball would not help Stokes' batting in the way that it did help McCullum's batting. I think Stokes can play with a bit of an angled bat at times, and I think the new ball will find that out a little bit. He's very good with the extra pace and the carry of the new ball, so I think that could be quite interesting. But I don't think he's particularly good when the ball's wobbling around as much from that perspective. And I would guess that there's a reason why England haven't moved him up the order in white ball cricket as much, whereas McCullum at least had played a lot of white ball cricket up the order. I see your point from a team perspective. I think it makes a lot more sense. I don't think it makes a lot more sense from a Stokes, the way he bats perspective. The only other thing I would say is that if he is bowling a lot, and I think that might be the end of your question as well. If he is bowling a lot, like there's a reason why seam bowling all-rounders generally don't bat in the top 3, even though Sobers could have batted top 3. Callis did bat in the top 3 and they moved him down. I would always, in fact, going back, Keith Miller probably batted too high for Australia. If they had him at number 4, would have made a lot more sense if he batted number 5 or number 6. But it makes a lot more sense for a seam bowler to, bat in that 5, 6, 7 period, just so that they have a little bit more rest before they go out to bat. Prashant says, congratulations on the Nuggets win. I earned this. Over the past 4 to 5 years, they've been one of the better teams. I might not want to use the term best. I think they might have the best record over the last 4 or 5 years, though. But due to a variety of reasons like form and injuries, they've not been able to win the championship. Would a cricketing equivalent of the same be Pakistan, who in major white ball tournaments, or the Indian team? I hesitate to compare them. So I think what the Denver Nuggets did that is replicable, that modern cricket teams don't do, is that they realized that to be successful, it would take a 5 to 7 year period. And if you have a look at their coach, they probably had 4 opportunities to sack their coach over their run. But they actually, when they went in, there were reasons why they lost. So you talk about form. Realistically, the first time that they lost in the playoffs, when they had a realistic chance of winning, which was in 2020 during the bubble, they were probably just a player short. And they tried to rectify that very, very soon after, and did so, and became a lot better of a team. But also they were waiting for younger players to develop. If you think about the way that international cricket teams and other NBA teams react, they would be like, well, this coach had a team that was pretty good and we lost to the finalists, but maybe we could get rid of him now. The following year, they fix some of those problems. They have development of one of their other players. Then when they get to the finals, their second best player is injured. They get to the second round, despite the fact that they don't deserve to get to the second round. Again, there are other teams and other situations where you could have looked at that and you would have said that the problem here is that the coach is not getting us anywhere, and you make that change. Next year, they have a second and third best player not being there. So it's never really been a case of form. When they were fully assembled and fit, they won the championship. And in the other years, when they hadn't yet fully assembled, or when they weren't fit, they didn't win the championship. That is what all professional sporting teams should be thinking about. And the Cronkies have a weird relationship across sport. Obviously, the whole Arsenal thing. They're not always been particularly popular, with their NFL ownership. Nuggets fans haven't always liked them. But the one thing that the Nuggets have done under the Cronkies is, we have a plan, let's stick to the plan, and let's trust it. And I think that you would be hard-pressed to say that the Indian or the Pakistani team has followed those kinds of things. And when I'm working for sporting teams, in some ways, when we had a bad season when I was at St. Lucia, and I remember coming off that season, and obviously everyone was a bit upset, and I was like, yeah, there's some things that we need to change. We made a lot of errors going through here. But if you look at the core of the younger players that we have and the core of a couple of the senior players that we have, there's something that can be turned around here quite easily, right? And instead, what happens at the end of that year? Everything happens. The coach is gone. I'm the general manager. I'm gone. There's a new ownership group comes in. A bunch of the younger players who I thought they should have been investing in and it could have done. They bring in a bunch of senior players. They have a really weird squad that next year. The core of what St. Lucia Stars were at that point was solid and could have been worked upon. And it's not the only team I've ever worked on where this has happened. And I'll tell you, the opposite one was when I was with in 2019 or 2018, 2019, whichever year it was. And we went from last to the final. And we should have won the final. So we almost went from last to winning the final in that year. And I think there was a lot of optimism around Stars at that point. Whereas I was looking at it going, we're actually quite lucky to make the finals in the first place. And we played very good cricket once we got to the finals, and we should have won the final. But we shouldn't be in a situation where we think that everything's done here. Is lots of things to do. And the one thing I've noticed from the Nuggets is that they talk about not skipping steps. What is going on? Sorry, I don't know why we're having dropouts today. There's something wrong with this computer at the moment. But yeah, I think the thing with the Nuggets is not skipping steps. And what I see with other teams over and over again, and the Australian cricket team does this, right? This isn't just an India and Pakistan thing or just the franchise cricket. Is teams regularly try and skip steps, or they don't look at why they've had the failure, right? So I don't know, if you came into a particular year where you already had weaknesses in your team, but one player does really, really well, and then you think, well, we fixed all those problems. We don't need to worry about that anymore. And then next year, if he doesn't have that exceptional year, you're going to have a regression, right? And the opposite is also true. You come into a year and you're like, oh, well, one all-rounder, and that all-round is injured or can't bowl or, just has a bad year. The ball doesn't come out of their fingers or whatever. In the next year, you should be making decisions based on, well, was it just an off year because it's a short season and we have those in T20 cricket? Is this player finished and everything else? And those sorts of conversations, I've tried to have them with cricket teams. Quite often, no one just wants to have those conversations, right? There aren't enough adults in the room, and there is a lot of panicking, and there is a lot of quick fixes, and all these sorts of things happen. It doesn't matter on what level of cricket. You see the same mistakes being done again and again. And I think that the Denver Nuggets, they're not the only team that ever did this, but it was very simple what they did. They got their stars early on, and then they backed their stars, and then they made sure that all the players around their stars would heighten their stars and also hide the flaws of their stars, right? They kept one coach so that you watch them in the playoffs, and you could see that even as Miami is throwing a different defensive look at them almost every possession, Denver can handle that because the core of that team know each other. They've played with each other. They have a shorthand with each other. And I think that, you can have success with changing your team in one moment. We saw, Toronto, we saw, start essentially a startup team win the IPL, not that long ago. But if you're looking for consistent wins over a long period of time, there's a lot of different aspects that need to be built in. And I think that a lot of cricket management is short-term thinking. It's still based around the old model of international cricket, which was flawed anyway, right? And I think there's a lot of better things that can be done. Ian says, English cricket and fans are pretty much consumed in an Ashes obsession. In fairness, I certainly was growing up too. Is it as big for Australians, or are World Cups prized more highly? I think Australia is still pretty enamored with Ashes cricket. I don't know if it's an interesting question, actually. I would still say that World Cups are slightly less important to the majority of Australian people than an Ashes. The difference is that the difference between them is very, very similar. Whereas I don't think it hurt England cricket as much as it should have that they weren't particularly good at World Cups for a long period of time. Whereas I think it really hurt them that they were not very good at the Ashes for a long period of time. I think the biggest difference is that in England, the Ashes is what cricket is. And I think in Australia, cricket is slightly more wide than that. And a lot of this comes from, you talk about yourself when you were younger, Ian, but a lot of this comes from the fact that for a long period of time, England was the only cricket team, or there was just them in Australia. And when you're the number one, the people who run the sport and do everything with it, and then you've got one opposition, that's a little bit different to Australia. Australia was never, the big daddy, right? They were always the smaller part of this. And I think for Australia, it was more about winning as much as possible. Whereas I think for English cricket, you would have to be honest and say that beating Australia is the most important thing. And even if they're just slight differences, they do matter. And it, I always find it really funny that when you're talking cricket people in Australian cricket, it's not that they never throw forward to the Ashes, but even when they throw forward to the Ashes, it's more of an aside, right? It's more of a, oh yeah, but how do you think that will play out in the Ashes? Whereas when someone in England does it, you feel like it almost doesn't matter what happens in this cricket that we're watching right here. It matters what's going to happen when the Ashes come around. And I think that is very, very different. Christopher says, thoughts on the Telegraph story from Tim Wigmore about the ICC rules for T20 leagues. So essentially, they're going to limit the amount of overseas players that are available, and the idea that all overseas leagues pay the boards for their players. So on that, let's go to the second one first. That makes a lot of sense to me. I would have set that up over a decade ago. We have seen that at times, but what usually happened was a player would get permission to play in a league and then would have to pay a percentage of their wage back to their team. So I think the England players in the IPL were the most notable versions of that I had heard of. Whereas that's not how it should work, right? It should be that you're paying the boards directly. It should be a percentage of whatever you're paying the player. On top of that, you also have to pay the boards. I think it's too late, but I think that is probably something that should have been looked at a long time ago in T20 cricket. The second one about the overseas players in leagues. I think the most important people in the cricket at the moment are the IPL owners. And I don't think that they will go for this. And I think that they will find a way to make this not work. But even if it works, let's say you never have more than 4 overseas players in any of these leagues in the world. And these IPL owners own all these different leagues everywhere. If you can still buy the 6 best players in the world, the basic problem still happens that let's say 10 IPL owners all have 6 players on their books that are the best players in the world. Well, that's the 60 best players in the world still having to ask for permission before they play for their national teams. Again, these rules are rules that should have been done a decade ago, even earlier, as this first started. They didn't want to have any discussions about all this sort of stuff back then. The CEOs were talking about all these sorts of things, and the chairman didn't want anything to do with it. And again, it's too late. I think the power shift is already so dynamic. I don't think that you stop capitalism with that. I think that there might even be lawsuit situations going ahead. And then you've got the fact that you might just start having the biggest leagues outside of cricket areas so that you can have as many overseas players as you want. So I can't see how this will work. It might slow it down in the short term, but I don't know. There's so much money on the other side. I just can't imagine that the ICC is going to be able to do what they think they're going to be able to do with that. Oh, it's the same one twice. Sorry about that. All right. Well, thank you to everyone on Patreon for that. I'll take another quick break here. And then after the break, we will get to the questions from the live chat. I'm sorry about the stream today, everyone. It has dropped out a couple of times. You're listening to Wagon Wheel. I am Jarrod Kimber. A few years ago, I had a panic attack after ESPN Cricinfo made me their global writer. I'd earned that position, but I also felt like a fraud at the time because I didn't really understand how I wrote. I understand that there was a process and gears and different styles and things, but how it all came together felt a little bit random. And so I began to panic like a golfer with a natural swing, worried one day I'd just end up with the yips. And would my career be over? So I took my writing apart piece by piece until I understood it. And then I figured out I could teach others all the mistakes I had learned. So I started an online course where I tried to make it as cheap as possible so people like me would be able to afford it. It's called Fans with Laptops, and heaps of people from around the world have used it so far, from first-time writers all the way through to professionals trying to improve. I started with a simple plan to make each writer the best they could be. And from the feedback I've received over the years, it seems like the course does that. But after COVID, my career changed. I came to YouTube, started podcasts, wrote emails, and formed a new career on my own going forward. So I now had something else to offer, the multimedia side of things, social media and everything else. Not to mention that I was building everything up as an independent. And so I added all of that to my course. So if you have ever wanted to work in sports as a writer or podcaster or making videos or anything else, Fans with Laptops is the place to start. If you think you qualify as a fan and you have a laptop and you want to work in sport, click on the link. All right. I just realized I've gone for an hour and I'm really worried about why my computer is crashing. So I'll just answer a couple. Thank you to Sega, who has got a super chat. Remember, if you're desperate for me to answer a question, spam in the comments on YouTube. Probably not going to get me to do it. Much more likely to do it if you do a super chat or just ask nicely, and I like it. We in fact, I'll say this for everyone on here. In general, like the Wagon Wheel works because of the quality of the questions, and we're hugely thankful to the Patreon audience who are their questions are really, really high quality. Bharat, when he started doing this, was shocked at how high quality the questions were. But even on the YouTube, they're really good as well. But we just can't get to all of them, of course. So, we can try and get to as many as we can. But Sega says, why has India failed to develop more test-paced bowlers besides the 4 we have? Well, I mean, the first question I would say is, when have India ever had 4 test bowlers of this quality before? That would kind of be like, it's going to be like Australia going, why can't we get more spinners while we have Shane Warne? Like, you've just had Shane Warne and you haven't had anyone like Shane Warne for 50 years. There's a reason why these things happen. Obviously, the pitches are not particularly conducive. Although Ranji, over a long period of time, there were, Unadkat certainly took a lot of wickets in the Ranji Trophy. So there certainly were a little bit more to that, but a lot of it is conditions based, right? There's a reason why over the entire history of Indian cricket, they haven't had as many seam bowls. In fact, I always talk about this, and I've never quite done a video on it, but I will one day. But the Pakistan thing is quite interesting, that reverse swing, wobble ball, and the doosra, and even the finger wrongin were all developed in Pakistan, right? And why did those balls all come out of Pakistan? You could say that Pakistanis are more creative than other cricket nations. You could say that they try more things. But the basic truth is that bowling on Pakistani wickets is quite often horrendous, right? There's nothing for any kind of bowls. They don't really help spin a lot of time. They don't really help seamers. So you actually have to try something that is out of the box. And there's a lot of development of cricket that comes from those sorts of things. Like, you always say that, Murali Kartik and Ashley Giles are both left-arm finger spinners, but they're two different species of humans, species of bowlers, right? Even though they both essentially do the same thing. And that's because where Ashley Giles is bowling, that his method works. So I think in India, it makes sense that you haven't had as many good fast bowlers. But I would say that you've got, obviously, some of these players have recently retired, but, Ishant's not retired, but not in the side. Bumrah, Siraj, Shami, Umesh Yadav obviously had a very good, run. Shardul's a very good, fourth bowler, a fourth seamer in certain situations, without doubt. I'm trying to think of, you have Prashid Krishna coming through, who's really, really interesting. Yeah, Natarajan, who had the ability to come in a test match. You still have Bhuvi Kumar around. Arshdeep Singh's been bowling. I was watching him bowl in county cricket yesterday. Was it yesterday? I was watching bowl in county cricket somewhere recently. So you actually have quite a few really talented bowlers there. At any one time, having 4 seamers of test match quality is a huge thing. Having 4 plus another bunch of other players who are quite skillful in different ways, or may be able to develop. I haven't mentioned Umran Malik in that as well, who's probably another one that could be on that list. I would say that India have a lot, but there is always going to be a limit to the way that Indian bowlers develop, in the same way that English bowlers, develop. English spinners, I should say, develop. There are reasons that these things exist. Thanks for the super chat, though, Sega. Oh wait, he had a second part of that, didn't he? And I completely missed it. How does Australia have more all-format pacers than other countries? Well, Australia is a place where bowling seam makes a lot more sense. So it goes to the other part of my question, right? It makes a lot more sense to bowl seam in Australia or South Africa than it does anywhere else. And specifically in Australia and South Africa, there are times when it helps to be skillful, and there are times when it helps to be fast. So you might get a Boland or a Philander, but you're also going to get, Lance Morris and Nokia and those sorts of bowlers as well. If you look at the other places where there's a lot of seam bowlers available at any one time, New Zealand and England, it doesn't make as much sense. You really want the skillful bowlers there more often than not, right? And so where you are from and the conditions that you have available to you is always going to affect your player talent pool. So I'm trying to think of someone who's a good example of this. So Josh Hazlewood probably bowls slower if he grows up in England. I was watching the 2015 Ashes today, because of course, why not? And I was watching him, and I just realized, and I had notes from the time, he was just so loose back then compared to what he is now. And he's obviously refined himself into, much more of a Glenn McGrath type bowler than he was. He had the reputation of being that kind of bowler, but I saw him bowl up almost an outswinger that went off the pitch at one stage. Really struggled with his line of length, over pitching, rank half volleys, all these sorts of things, down leg side, 2 straight. And this is in a couple of spells that I saw him bowl. If he comes up to the English system, he's going to be 5 to 10 miles an hour slower, most probably. And he's going to be a real line and length merchant. He'd probably be a lot more like Ollie Robinson. So by the time he gets into the Test cricket, he can put the ball exactly where he wants. He's much more skillful, but he doesn't have the ability to occasionally bowl over 90 miles an hour and knock people's heads off. And that is because in Sydney pitches, occasionally he would have needed to do that. And then in Shield cricket, he would have occasionally needed to do that. And then again, in Test cricket, he would have needed to do that. Whereas Ollie Robertson grew up in an environment where all he had to, and I'm not saying he could have ever got to 90 miles an hour because I have no idea, but all he had to ever do was just keep working on his skills. And he was the most skillful bowler in the country. And then he gets to Test cricket. I think South Africa and Australia specifically have more rounded bowlers. Jimmy Anderson started as a fast bowler, right, and ends up as a medium fast bowler because that is what is what was going to work for him the majority of the time. Whereas Dale Steyn maintains his pace all the way through because he didn't really want to get to a point where he's bowling 80 miles an hour in South Africa unless you are of a Vernon Philander level, right? And Dale Steyn, as skillful as he was never Vernon Philander. So I think all these things play a part. Great question there. Segar, and thank you for the super chat. Chris says, what benefits do domestic cricket teams and associations get when a player from their system gets selected for the national team? So this probably depends on what domestic league you're looking at. There are some. I suppose the best way of looking at it is it allows you to get more players onto contract because you moved a player. And this would be the case pretty much right across most major international nations now. You have the ability to still pick that player when they're available, which obviously isn't going to be that much, but also you can fit an extra person in your squad, right? From a marketing perspective, which I don't think county cricket plays a huge part. You certainly have that available to you. From a promotions area, if you have a local ball here who does well, they're probably going to inspire more people, which means you have the ability to find more players available in your area from that side, Chris. There were financial benefits in the county system for counties that produced international cricketers. I'm not sure if they're still there, but I do remember that, or at least a conversation about that. I'm not sure there are that many for anyone else. And it is why you see teams like Victoria and Nottingham who recruit players that they know will be available all year round who are really, really good, rather than perhaps going, taking a chance on a 20-year-old. So, it's what you're saying here, Chris, is the eternal argument between Victorian cricket and New South Wales cricket. Whereas Victorian cricket will try and make sure that their team is as strong as possible pretty much every. They don't play as many younger players. They don't push talent through. They recruit quite heavily from other states if they think there's a player who's, can help them in their side. And New South Wales tend to, over the history of their time, produce a lot more Australian players, despite the fact that they have fewer cricketers in New South Wales than they do in Victoria. They produce a lot more Australian players from that perspective, and because of that, they still go on to win more Shield titles than Victoria, but they are maybe not as consistently as good as Victoria have been over long periods of time by doing that. Victoria will say, well, yes, we're helping the Victorian team, but also it means that we have, Chris Rogers available when the Australian team needs them, or Scott Boland available, or Colin Miller. Or was Colin Miller playing for Tassie? Actually, he was playing for Tassie. We'll take him away. But, players who are slightly older but are battle tested, who are ready to come in, Shane Harwood and, Mick Lewis, those sorts of players. So there's no proper way of doing it, but a lot of it is about pride. And so I think your question is probably saying, what is the point of domestic teams doing that? I think if you're a domestic team and you don't produce any international players, that you would say that outside of county cricket, where domestic cricket, I'm not talking about the T20 leagues here as much, but outside of county cricket, there really isn't any, huge boost of having a big star in your local team. If no one's going to watch the Ranji or Shield cricket or, Plunket Shield or whatever it may be, Red Stripe. It's not been called Red Stripe for ages, I don't think, but that's the name in my head. If someone's going to play in those levels of cricket, you're probably not going to get a huge amount out of that sort of thing at all. But the whole thing of why first-class teams exist is really, really interesting, because I think in county cricket and Victoria, to take those two different examples, I think they do think that the team should be strong, and that team really matters for us. I think New South Wales is more of a development squad for the Australian team. Prashant says, shouldn't the review be retained if the bowling team reviews and then find out if there's a no ball? Is that not reviewed? I didn't know about that. Sorry, is that not retained? Yes. I found I'm going to do something on no balls, probably for this Ashes, because I think there's something going on there. I found it very interesting that there are a lot of, the third umpire is supposed to be looking at these no balls, and yet we were still finding them out on review. which suggests to me that there's still something going on that is not quite right within the game in that process. But yeah, I kind of agree with you. That's an umpiring error at that point, isn't it? It's, was the ball legal or was it not legal? Well, can we find that out first, and then we'll then give us our 15 seconds to decide on our whether we're going to take a review or not. That would make a lot more sense to me, and I certainly understand what you're coming. I can't remember if that is the law though, or the regulation at this time, Prashant. So I'd have to go and have a look at that. But yes, if that is not the case, then I would have said that would have made more sense. Just the last couple here that I saw in the chat. But huge thanks to Prashant, Chris, and Sega for their super chats there. Henry says, who do you think is the best fast bowler of all time and in the world right now? The best fast bowler of all time. I think Malcolm Marshall probably has a very good claim to that. I've got this theory that Joel Garner is probably very close to the best fast bowler of all time, but because he bowled first change so often, his figures maybe do not quite reflect that as much and didn't get access to the new ball. Who else would I have in that? I think Dale Steyn probably has, and Glenn McGrath certainly in that conversation as well. Sydney Barnes, I've done enough research on Sydney Barnes to say that as fantastic as he was, I don't think he's quite in that level. I love Hadley as well. I think Hadley was absolutely fantastic. And as I said before, I wonder if Hadley had played somewhere else, his numbers would probably be even better. But he had to do so much of a heavy load. He probably doesn't, get the same. Hadley's going to have a lot more 5-wicket hauls than Joel Garner, but Joel Garner probably didn't have to bowl when he was tired as much as Richard Hadley. So it's an interesting one from that perspective. Right at the moment, I looked at Pat Cummins' figures recently, and I felt like he hasn't bowled as well in the last 2 years as he did in the 2 years before that. And his record did not suggest that at all. Bumrah is obviously absolutely incredible as well. I don't know if I'd have Bumrah ahead of Pat Cummins. Rabada kind of feels like the third wheel behind those two, just because he quite often maybe goes for more runs at times than they do. But again, is an absolutely fantastic bowler. Am I missing someone obvious in all of that? I really like Jameson, so that's another one. But Jameson hasn't quite proved himself at that level. But then, yeah, I think those are the ones. I feel like I'm missing someone really. I mean, Anderson's still there as well, of course, but I don't think Anderson can do it as many different places as Rabada and Bumrah and Cummins can. So I do think that probably downplays him a little bit as well. And then Shaheen. Shaheen's numbers, I think, are still really, really good. But again, a bit like Jameson, I just feel like I kind of haven't seen him play as much as I would want to quite put him there. Whereas Bumrah has a long enough career now that we've seen enough. Although even with Bumrah, it's a bit tricky. But yeah, I think it's probably still Cummins. Whether it'll be still Cummins in a year and a half, I don't know. SBM says, how much of a difference does coaching or coaches make at the international level? Look, I think we'd have to agree that McCullum came in with a completely different game plan, which changed the way that England played. It would be hard to say that coaches have no impact based on that. It's a very different role at the international level compared to any other level, because the vast majority of the players come and know what to do. And so first-class coaching is a very different job altogether. International coaching is, a lot more to do with ego management and schedule management and, dealing with flying and all those sorts of things, which might sound silly, but is part of being that job. I still think the best coach in the world is probably over a long period of time less useful to you than your top eight players at any time. McCullum might be the exception, but even then, over a long period of time, we would have to check that. I think you can make a lot of changes over a short period of time that can help, but I generally think that we overestimate how much a coach can do. And also, cricket's such a weird game because of captains as well. It's almost like you've got two different conflicting coaches at any one time. But huge thanks to everyone. Great questions again today, and sorry about the dropouts in the middle there, but yeah, just thank you so much for your support. We are just for those who do want to ask questions and do want to be involved in the chats here, and thank you so much. So many questions in the chat today, but we had so many on Patreon, it was hard to get to them all. If you do want to keep asking questions, whether they're super chats or non-super chats, we are going to be moving all the Wagon Wheels, the Uncovered, Footmarks, all those sorts of shows will go over to a new channel that we have started, which is called Jarrod Kimber Podcast, just because we've got too much content on the main channel. So we're just going to filter that out. So if you do like these sorts of live chats, you don't have to go and subscribe straight away, but the sooner you go and subscribe to Jarrod Kimber Podcasts, the better. You should be able to find that on your YouTube. And if you subscribe over there, what we want to do is even eventually get more and more chats happening over there, whereas we're limited by the amount of hours that we can actually put anything on this particular channel. But huge thanks to everyone for all their questions again today, and all their support on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and anyone who's done my sports writing course and everything else. We'll have an Uncovered, which I will have to record from Edgbaston, unless we have an incredibly short test match up there. But we'll have that for you next week. But there's plenty more content. Follow for the Ashes content. And now we also know that when the West Indies-India series is going to be played as well. So I'll quickly be going off and trying to plan for that one as well. But huge thanks to everyone, and I'll see you again next time.
Let me tell you a story. When I was a kid, people would ask my dad if he wanted me to be Viv Richards. And he always said no, he wanted me to be Boycott, because apparently he liked boring things. But anyway, it turned out I could be neither. But thanks to Bodyline t-shirts, I can wear clothes showing both players. The Boycott Stick of Rhubarb is one of my favourite t-shirts. I really like the design. And it's not the only one I love. There's also a WG Grace one where he's in a pedalo, which is a part of my everyday wardrobe now. But there are heaps of other cool shirts on this site, and you can search for them by nations or type, and they seem to add to them all the time. I'm a big fan of the Court Marsh Bold Lily in the Australian collection, and there's also a lovely Morning Everyone in honour of Richie Benaud's great greeting. The English area has the Fast Leg Theory shirt, which I think is a ripper. There's a couple of great West Indian ones I love, including this simple Viv Richards design, and a couple of Capel Dev t-shirts in the Indian section that I simply must have. I'm not saying that Bodyline t-shirts will have something that you will like, but I will say this: they got me to wear a Jeffrey Boycott inspired t-shirt. And that in itself is a minor miracle.